Hello again. This is the second of two videos about political parties. In this one, we're going to take up our remaining major topic, which is the three different dimensions or faces of political parties. In other words, when we say political parties, we could usually mean one of three different things. The first is we speak of the party as an organization, the official party, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the national, state, and local party committees or organizations themselves. Most of us don't literally participate in that. What we do is we participate in our parties as voters, in other words, the party and the electorate. So the citizens who identify themselves as Republicans or Democrats, we call that party ID or party identification. That's the party and the electorate. So that's the second face or dimension of parties. And the third is the party in government. And that is the elected and appointed officials who carry the label of their party with them. The Republicans in Congress, the Democrats in the Senate, that sort of thing. And as I said previously, parties are kind of the way legislatures organize themselves. They are divided into parties. And that's just not in the United States, but that's basically everywhere. So when we speak of parties, we often use the term partisanship. Partisanship means belonging to a party or being guided by a party. Sometimes it's used as a pejorative or negative term, but it really isn't. I mean, in political science, it's just a neutral term. It is simply intended to describe, people's motivations for doing things. Now, these dimensions kind of relate to each other because the party organization, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, national, state, local organizations, they develop a lot of ideologies and policies that respond to various things that are happening in the society at the time, the structural forces, things happening in the economy or the international arena someplace. And then the candidates who identify with that party adopt strategies to try to build electoral coalitions, go to the voters, the party and the electorate, so that they themselves, the candidates, can become the party in government. So the three dimensions are all related to each other. And many of these, and when I say the structure, when I say that the parties are responding to things, I mentioned this earlier on in the course, but we're speaking of things like the economy, the rise and fall of various economic sectors, the way the economy affects us at the local level, the big scale picture of interest rates and this sort of thing, the international environment, the class structure of the society, all these demographics we've discussed, migration, immigration, etc., and all these political questions. All that supplies sort of grist for the mill of parties to take positions on that candidates run on, and then they appeal to the voters and the electorate. So first, let's take the parties as organizations, then we'll talk about the party and the electorate, and then we'll talk about the party and government. So when I say the party organizations, these are copies, screenshots from the web pages, the entry pages, where you come first if you go to the Democratic National Committee or the Republican National Committee. Democratic National Committee because at the time this screenshot is taken, there's a Democrat in the White House, so they're promoting the Democrat in the White House on their front page. What's really, and as you can see, a lot of what the parties do right up front is try to raise money. That's a major focus for political parties in the United States, is fundraising. And over to the right, you see what you see if you go straight as of this date. If you go to the Republican National Committee, and what you see, I think this is kind of surprising, is you see a former president, not the current president. You see a former president and raising money for him as if he were the party. What's unusual about this is that parties normally don't endorse a candidate until after that candidate has received the party's nomination. So right now, the Democrats are supporting Biden because he's their president and he's in office. But it was unusual, for example, in the 2016 election when the Democratic National Committee was supporting Hillary Clinton before she got the nomination. And it caused a lot of controversy. And Bernie Sanders and others were very upset about the fact that the party organization was taken over by the Clinton supporters. And now we see the same thing. In this case, we see the same thing happening with Republicans, where There are lots of people that want to be the nominee for the Republicans in 2024, and even after he lost the 2020 election, the party is still acting like it's a wholly owned subsidiary of the Donald Trump company. So that's kind of unusual when parties do that, and it can create lots of intra-party problems when the formal organization sides with a candidate before the voters have decided who they want to choose, before the primaries. But it does happen. So parties are organized at all levels. That's the point here. They're organized into groups: national committee, state, congressional level, counties, cities, states, legislative districts, wards, precincts. The parties are organized at every single level of our political system. And at all those levels, typically they do fundraising, they formulate issues, devise strategy, do polling, do a lot of polling, research on issues, and advertising. So they do all these things. You have to understand parties operating not just at the national level, but all the way down to the precinct level. And, citizens can get involved with them at all those levels if that's what they want to do. You could go out and volunteer in your local ward level or precinct level organization. Now let's talk a bit about parties as organizations and what they do with the issues. Every presidential year, parties produce what's called a platform. Now this comes from the party. This does not come from the candidates. The party does this, and the candidates theoretically are supposed to run on the party's platform, but in the United States, because parties are not as strong as they are in many European countries, the parties can't discipline people and force them, usually can't force them to adopt all the party's positions. They try to, but often candidates diverge from it, but they'll make a platform anyway. So back in 2016, the Democratic Party platform, their theme, this is when Hillary Clinton was the nominee, Stronger Together. And as you can see, that was the whole theme for their major issues. An economy that works for everyone, that grows incomes for working people, supporting a middle-class life, sustainable, environmentally sustainable economic growth, good-paying jobs, economic fairness. You see a lot of this prioritized economic issues, long-term investment, the common interest over self-interest, do something about extreme levels of income and wealth inequality. So that's the Democrats. And the Republican platform in 2016 was very much anti-incumbent, because at that point in 2016, we'd had a Democratic president for 8 years, President Obama. And so they predictably run against the record and say, oh, the economy is terrible, our standing in world affairs has declined. And these are all statements that they made. They argue that our healthcare system has been taken apart. This is kind of a strange claim in view of the fact that the healthcare system was reinforced by the Affordable Care Act that expanded medical coverage to tens of millions more Americans who didn't have it. So it's hard to see how it was dismantled when its coverage was greatly expanded. But in any event, these are positions that they took. Now, interesting thing, just to show you what happened in 2020. Here are the main points of the Democratic Party platform. Protecting Americans and recovering from the COVID pandemic, building a stronger, fairer economy, affordable health care, protecting communities, reforming the criminal justice system, healing the soul of America, combating climate crisis, restoring our democracy, addressing immigration, education, American leadership, and so forth. Well, that's a platform that probably sounds somewhat familiar. These are familiar Democratic issues and approaches. But the Republican Party in 2020 was really unprecedented, because they decided in 2020 that they would not have a platform. They said, well, we're fine with the 2016 platform, and we're not going to do another one until 2024, and instead we're going to just say we support whatever Trump is promoting. This is, in my experience, unprecedented, that a party was so dominated by a single person that he did not even allow them to have a platform of their own, independent of what he wanted. Everything was about his agenda. So they resolved that the party would support Trump's agenda, and that the 2020 Republican National Convention would adjourn without adopting a new platform until 2024. So unprecedented that anyone could dominate a party so completely that they wouldn't even perform their basic function of coming up with a party platform of their own ideas, independent of him. Everything's about him. And of course, they lost. And so the interesting question then becomes, how does a party move forward from that type of domination? And we'll have to see how that goes. Could go any number of ways. The parties, apart from just platforms, just as organizations, they tend to disagree on certain issues. Taxing and spending priorities are very typical areas of disagreement. Immigration, the whole question of group inequalities and racial disparities especially. Foreign policy, the environmental issues, environmental regulation, the issues of climate change or global warming. Economic policy generally, the healthcare issue, what should be the federal government's responsibility in providing healthcare or health insurance. Criminal justice, you may be very familiar with that. Public education, they differ on that. Abortion rights, immigration generally, and then increasingly, which is kind of a new area of disagreement, massive disagreement about who should become a federal judge. And we have discussed this at some length, but just to understand there was a time when parties didn't disagree so much about that. Okay, next phase of party is parties in the electorate. There you have people booing. This is the voters. And we call this party ID or party identification. Now, many people consider themselves Democrats or Republicans or Greens or Libertarians or whatever without necessarily formalizing it. They may never send a dime to anyone. They may or may not even register that way. You can certainly register as a Republican or a Democrat. Sometimes people don't, but they still consider themselves that. So this is a very slippery thing to measure, party ID. But it's a significant factor. There are many ways you can identify with a party. Well, you can say that's who you are when you register. You can send them money, contributions to candidates or the party. You can find out what your party endorses or who your party endorses and support that person or that issue the way your party guides you. You can see issues in the way the party frames them. You can volunteer. You can go door to door, knock on doors for the party to get signatures, to see who's going to vote and that sort of thing. You can go to events, fundraisers, and so forth. And you can put up signs. A lot of people do this. Yard signs, buttons, bumper stickers. These are all ways in which you can identify with a party if you want to. And both parties have critical core supporters, the ones they're really counting on. Now, this is, of course, not all the people they're looking to vote for them, but these are the groups they really, really want, and they need to please these voters if they possibly can, because this is where the critical turnout comes from. This is what we call the core or the base of parties. So for Republicans, the so-called evangelical Christians, which is basically most of them are non-denominational, non-denominational Christianity, sometimes called born again or whatever, but in the political terminology, often called evangelicals, sometimes called the religious right. There are many different terms for this, but it is a group of Christians who identify with the Republican Party and with conservative politics. That's part of the Republican base. Another is the corporate sector. They really expect the support of industrial corporations. Financial sector, not necessarily so much. That has sometimes gone more democratic. But the old line smokestack industries, the executives from those industries and so forth, they certainly count on their support. The oil industry, the petrochemical industry, and the sort of thing. Rural voters tend to vote overwhelmingly Republican, meaning farm areas, rural areas, outside cities, outside suburbs. And then, of course, ideological conservatives. These are core groups that the Republican Party counts on. The Democratic Party counts very heavily on black voters who vote overwhelmingly Democratic, to the tune of 85 to 95% in almost all elections. Also, union members. Union members have been historically predominantly Democratic. Voters in cities generally, the urban vote tends to be, just like the rural vote tends to be Republican, the urban vote tends to go Democratic. And then ideological liberals and progressives. And another group that has been increasingly become democratic in recent years is single women. Now, there are other groups of people who are more in the realm of swing voters. Both parties try to appeal to them. Hispanic or Latino voters have tended to go Democratic, but sometimes they can be persuaded to go Republican, as can Asian voters. It depends on the area of the country and the type of candidate and appeal that's made to them. And there are other voters and subsectors of voters that can be persuaded to go either way. The most important one is in terms of important in politics, but the most important in terms of its size is the suburban vote, because the suburbs house about half of Americans. So you got maybe 30% in cities, 20% rural, and 50% in suburbs, and so that's a swing vote area. And a lot of candidates in both parties try very hard to bring in the suburban vote, and that is an increasingly diverse vote. It used to be a predominantly white vote, but now the suburbs are much more diverse than they used to be. So they're more hotly contested by both parties. Parties overall, again, talking about parties in the electorate, their hold over the electorate has actually kind of declined over the last 100 to 125 or 30 years. And instead, what we have seen is the rise of what we call candidate-centered politics. And this started in the progressive era, back in the 1890s through World War I, with a number of reforms that the progressives managed to get adopted in a lot of states that made it hard for parties to control the electorate the way they used to. For example, primary elections. Well, the voters choose the party's candidates. Now, we think that's normal, but that's actually a bit unusual. Why? I mean, it used to be the parties chose the candidates and put the parties out there. They just had a meeting and said, here's who's going to be our candidate for president. Here's who's going to be our candidate for governor. Here's who's going to be our candidate for city council in each of the 50 wards. We didn't get to vote for them, but the progressives created primary elections where we get to choose the candidates. And sometimes the voters choose a candidate that the party doesn't even like. And so that's an interesting phenomenon. I mean, it'd be interesting to know, would Donald Trump, for example, have been nominated as president if the party leaders had picked the nominee? The party leaders, the voters in the primaries, gave Trump a lot of support. But initially, when he first started running, the people running the Republican Party were much more enthusiastic about people like Jeb Bush and some of the others. There were some who wanted Mitt Romney, I guess, and so forth. But they wanted more establishment candidates who were closer to the party leaders. But, with primaries, and there are many other examples of this in both Democratic and Republican parties where outsider candidates seize nominations for Congress or whatever it might be, and the party leaders went, oh no, that candidate is not necessarily good for us in the long run, but there's nothing they could do about it. So that weakened parties. Primaries weaken parties. The government ballot, so-called Australian ballot, it used to be that the parties printed their own ballots the way they wanted them to look. And you'd walk in with a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot or whatever. And so you could only vote for the candidates that your party put on that ballot. Well, now the government prints the ballot and all the candidates are on them. And so you can choose whoever you want. And it leads to people picking and choosing candidates as opposed to who the party wanted them to have. Civil service, well, why does civil service matter? Because with civil service, there's a lot of jobs that the parties can't dole out the way they used to. It used to be before civil service party won an election, they could decide who get a whole array of government jobs. And there aren't that many jobs left for parties and mayors and presidents and so forth to dole out like they used to. Personal registration, well, you have to register to vote far in advance of the election in many states. It varies, of course, but it could be as much as 30 days before the election. So that means the parties can't sort of run around in many states. They can't run around and drum up the vote the day of or the day before the election the way they used to. And then these direct democracy reforms, the initiative, the referendum, and the recall, where the voters get to legislate. In the state of California, a number of other states, if you get enough signatures, you can put a law on the ballot and the voters can enact the law just by approving it. No government official involved at all. They can even amend the state constitution by initiative. And they can recall officials in the middle of their term, have a special election and recall them. Well, all these things weakened parties. Also, the rise of interest groups, which you've already talked about. the importance of money and technology in campaigning, and the rise of just candidate-centered politics, which I'm about to talk more about. All this has led to candidates being much more like coalitions of interest coming together to raise a lot of money. Now, candidate-centered politics is the type of politics where candidates create their own organizations, independent of the party. They raise their own money. They hire their own campaign staff and consultants. They do their own polling. They get their own volunteers, things that the parties used to do for them. And mainly what they want for the parties is financial support. They go and get the nomination with their own organization rather than the party. And once they get the nomination, they demand that the party support them. And what's the party going to do? They're the candidate. And so in many elections, for many voters, the election turns more on the candidate's image than the ideology. Many voters don't, they say, I like the candidate. I want to vote for a candidate, a person, rather than a party. This leads to what we call capital-intensive elections, capital meaning money, rather than labor-intensive elections. Parties are good at supplying people, volunteers. Interest groups are great at supplying money. And so candidates turn to interest groups. They raise money through interests. They can run their own campaign, get the nomination, and turn to the party and say, I expect your support. Now give me more money. And then comes this big important factor, the rise of the independent or non-aligned voter. Now, if you look at this, this is two graphs from the Gallup organization about party identification. And the one on the left includes three. It says in politics as of today, do you consider yourself a Republican, a Democrat, or an independent? So you see the blue line is Democratic, the red line is Republican, and you see between the two parties that the Democrats have a slight edge. But the third one is independent, and look how that has shot up. Since about 2006, 2007, the independents have shot up. And there have been times when they were very high in the past, too, back in the 1980s and 90s as well. But it has shot up that many people say they are independents. They're up by 42 to 29 to 27. So the number one choice of Americans, if they're given the choice, are you a Democrat, Republican, or an independent, is to say, I'm an independent. All right, now let's look on the right. Now here in this one, if you said you were an independent, they said, which way do you lean? Do you lean more toward the Republicans or the Democrats? So the gray line, now you have to choose Republican or Democrat. And some people wouldn't choose, but there you go. You can see where we are. So we've got 89% of them chose one or the other. And you can see when it drops out, you get 46% Democratic and 43% Republican. But understand, a lot of those people who were basically forced in this poll to choose Republican or Democrat, that's the way the ballot is structured. There's no independent party to vote for. So it's critical to know how the independent, or sometimes they're called centrist, but they're not necessarily centrist. They're just not aligned with a party. It's critical to know how they're going to vote. And candidates, Republican and Democratic candidates, have to find ways to appeal to independent or non-aligned voters, which is a real challenge for them. Why? Because while they're doing that, they have to satisfy their base. If you lose your base, you can't win anyway. So you have to appeal to the base, and they have an ideology, but at the same time, it's necessary to try to reach out to the independents. So how do you do it? Well, there's a variety of ways. Now, one thing that has happened is this. In the United States and around the world, we've seen a rise of what we call populism. And populism is a loose ideological perspective. It is based on the argument, and many people believe this, that there are two kinds of people in society. The people who are good or pure, and the elite who run everything and they're corrupt. And that's the way society is structured. And we call it populism. Or look at it as the belief that the people who have power, who have wealth, experience, expertise, education, well, you can't trust them. The governmental elites, the social elites, the economic, educational, professional elites, you can't trust them. And that would include political parties. Now, I'm not saying I believe that. I'm saying this is what populism believes. So there's a cartoon over here where a passenger in an airplane says, "These smug pilots have lost touch with regular passengers like us. Who thinks I should fly the plane?" See? So, I mean, it's making fun of this notion that people, the ordinary people who don't know as much about things as the elites in all these fields should actually be running the show. But that's populism. Trump definitely ran as a populist, and his slogan, "Drain the Swamp," was all about, doing away with the power of elites in Washington. Many people don't want to take vaccines because they hear people like Joe Rogan and other people who don't know anything at all about vaccines, and high school graduates and such, claiming to know more about science than the scientists. That's a classic populist appeal. And what you see, the politics of populism is to circumvent the party, to say, who needs the party? I'm going straight to the people. And it leads to these strongman outsider candidates. And they tend to be right wingers around. That's the current way. It doesn't have to be that way. Populism, there could be left wing populism, but right now, this sort of right wing anti government populism is on the rise. So we see it not just in the United States with the election of Trump, but also in Hungary, in Brazil, in Poland, in India, the Philippines, and a number of other places. You see strongman type candidates, and they are men typically. Not always. There's also there are female sort of strongman, so to speak, candidates as well. But it is this argument of forget about the party, forget about the government, forget about the experts. Don't do what they say. Just listen to me. I'm talking to you straight, to the good people, to the real people. That type of appeal is called populism, and it undermines political parties, and it leads often to very disturbing outcomes, where when strong men get in power, these populist candidates, they want to extinguish civil liberties, manipulate elections, or do away with elections, and make themselves sort of, president for life with the support of their followers. And that is anti-democratic. And going from a strong man to the masses may seem like democracy, but actually it's not. In political science terms, we would not consider that a functioning democracy, because we believe typically that strong parties and also interest groups and other institutions are necessary to mobilize groups of people and help them understand politics and decide what they believe. We don't typically think that one person, one autocrat, is the best way to govern a society of hundreds of millions of people. But that is what populism leads to. Last face of parties is the party in government. We talked about the party organization. We talked about the party and the electorate. Let's talk about the party in government. And so there you see, a picture of the House of Representatives. And I'll give you three models. There's three theoretical models that we use for understanding what parties do and how they relate to democracy. So parties control the government. They staff the government. We know that. But how does that relate to democracy? And there are three models I'd like you to think about, three different ways to conceive about it, and then ask yourself which one you think is the more accurate model. So the first one we call the responsible party model, which I'll explain. But in essence, the idea is that voters hold the parties responsible for what they promise to do. Second, the electoral competition model, which kind of models parties as if they were business firms trying to appeal to customers. And third, the electoral reward and punishment model, also called retrospective voting, which says the voters look backward and decide in each election year how the parties have done in the past. Now, the responsible party model, let's take them one by one. The responsible party model is based on some assumptions. In order for this to work, this is what you have to have. The parties have to take clear positions on the issues, so you know which party is saying they're going to do what. There are differences between the parties. You have to know what those differences are. They state them. The parties then, according to this model, they select candidates based on the positions they've taken on the issues. So each one of these, you should ask yourself if you believe this is true. Third, the voters are informed. And, the parties choose the candidates based on their positions so that the parties know what the candidates believe. The candidates know what the party wants them to believe. And then the voters are informed and choose the candidates based upon their issue positions. Is that true? But that's what the model says. Then the model implies that one party has to win. Divided government doesn't work well in this model. And then the parties force the officials to do what they promised to do. You got elected as a Republican. We supported you. the party supports this position on immigration. We expect you as an elected official to adhere to that position. And then if you don't, we don't support you. So the policies typically reflect the issue positions the parties took. The result is ultimately that voters hold the parties responsible for the outcomes, which are the result of the policies they adopted. And then if they don't like what the party did, they kick them out. Now the problem is that these conditions don't prevail very well in the United States. Often the parties, sometimes they take clear positions on issues and you know the differences, and sometimes they don't. But are the voters really informed? Well, we know the voters tend not to be terribly informed. Often we don't have clear winners. Often we have individual candidates win, but control of the government may be divided. And it's hard for our parties to hold elected officials to anything. As I showed you, I mean, Trump wouldn't even let the Republican Party have a platform. So yeah, sometimes these conditions prevail in some states, and sometimes at the national level they do, and other times they don't. It just depends on conditions. So this is what you need to think about. Then second model, electoral competition model from a political scientist named Anthony Downs, excuse me, an economist. Also, looks at the parties as if they were big corporations like McDonald's and Burger King. Now, let me ask you, have you ever noticed when you're in an urban area that the fast food restaurants are often clustered together? They're in the same place. You might ask, well, why don't they spread out? And the answer is because they want to be close to the demographic center of their customer base. And they want to compete for the geographical center of where the most customers are. So, candidates, this is what leads in this model to candidates starting their campaigns at the primary level, out at the end of the spectrum, secure the base, but then move to the middle where the more people are. See that line, that red line is supposed to represent the number of voters. So that typically under this model, which is just a model, the idea is that they move to the center. The volunteers, the donors, the primary voters, they're out there at the ends, the left and right. But most of the voters are in the middle. And so as the general election gets near, the party, as in the candidates, move to the middle. Now, do they really do that? Again, this is a theoretical model. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Historically, this was the way it always worked, but in recent years, we have seen candidates run more to the extremes and stay there, trying to win by generating massive turnout from the base rather than worrying about the non-aligned voters in the middle. So it's not the only way to do things, but sometimes it is exactly what they do. Third is the electoral reward and punishment model. And this is what we call retrospective voting. Retrospective means looking backwards. Classic example, Ronald Reagan in 1980, when he ran for president the first time, he says, ask yourself, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? And the theory is, it doesn't matter what party you're with. The point is, just think about the last 4 years. He was going after Democrats, and he knew some Democrats were mad, even though he was a Republican, he thought he could get, and he did get, Democratic votes by saying, look, the Democratic President Jimmy Carter, you haven't been better off these last 4 years, so you should just make a change. So it's a non-ideological view of the voters, that all they care about is how things have been going in the last few years. And if things have not been going well, they throw out the incumbent and try the other party. So it's basically kind of a non-ideological view of voters. And it assumes that they don't believe campaign promises. They don't care what the candidates say they're going to do, because they don't believe it. They just, if times have been good, they support the incumbent. If times have been bad, they support challengers. And so if you believe this model, then what you want to look at is all the polling about how well is the country doing at the moment. How's the economy doing? Are we at war? Are we in peace? Because if this model is correct, then that's what people would be looking at. So last slide here. Just ask yourself which model you think best describes how American politics really works. For example, in the responsible party model, do the Republicans and Democrats establish clear positions and follow through on them, and then the voters choose candidates based on party positions and platforms, and the parties hold them to it? Electoral competition, or do you see the parties moving to the center as the general election approaches? Are they similar or are they different? And then the electoral reward and punishment or retrospective voting model. What are the voters doing? What are they thinking about? Are they thinking about the past or the future? Do they care about campaign promises, or they just want to know how things have been going? Or is it possible that there are some voters who are more like the ideological responsible party voters, and maybe some who are more just maybe those voters in the middle, maybe those swing voters we talked about, maybe they're more thinking just about how things have gone the last few years and should we make a change or not. But you can give some thought to this. This is a very likely exam question that you might see. So, and you can decide how you think voting works in this country and how this has affected our political parties, because the parties have to appeal to the voters. And so the question is, how are the voters thinking and how do they make their decisions? And that concludes our presentation about political parties. That's the end of the second of 2 videos.